Good evening and welcome to this special webinar brought to you by the Charity for Civil Servants in partnership with Surviving Economic Abuse. We'll be starting shortly, but before we do, please be aware that a number of issues will be discussed in this session that some people may find upsetting. If you are affected by anything that is covered, details of how you can access follow-up support and advice are given towards the end of the broadcast, so please stay tuned. Thank you. Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Economic Abuse, brought to you by the Charity for Civil Servants and Surviving Economic Abuse. My name is Kevin and I'm one of your hosts for today. I'll introduce my colleagues to you in just a moment. Before we do, just a quick bit of housekeeping. For everyone joining us online today, if you're live in the session, then you will be able to put in your comments, thoughts and questions, and you should see a console on the screen where you'll be able to do that. This is a pre-recorded session, so any questions that you do put through will not be answered live. However, we will be posting a link on our website to both the recording and the questions once we've had a chance to respond to them. I'm now just going to introduce you to my colleague, Elaine Jeffries, who is our Head of Money Advice Services, and she's going to, first of all, just tell you a little bit more about the charity and her role.
Thank you, Kevin. Our vision is a lifelong community of people offering effective support for each other when life takes a turn for the worse. We are primarily involved with money advice, but we also do other services, well-being and caring and health as well, which we try and work together. In money advice, we deal with debts primarily, but also we do debt solutions. We can advise people about all kinds of debt solutions. And
we also offer a lot of support around well-being and mental health, don't we, as well?
Yes, we do. So, and they all work together, and we also do financial assistance that goes along with that. And sometimes we are able to offer financial assistance with priority debts when the need comes along. Today, we are joined by Nicola Sharp-Jeffs, who's the founder and the director of Surviving Economic Abuse, and she's going to talk us through her presentation.
So before we do that, Elaine, just briefly, obviously economic abuse is a very serious but very important subject. Why have we decided to look at that particularly today in this session?
We've found that many of our applicants have come to us, and it's quite obvious that they have issues with economic abuse, and they haven't been able to find any information, and they don't really want to talk about it. They don't know where to go. So we thought it would be a really good idea to start by introducing the idea of economic abuse and how that might affect people, particularly in the workplace.
So I guess some people don't even realise that's what they're going through potentially.
No, absolutely.
So this session will obviously is recorded and will be available, and obviously hope that people find it useful, and we'll share it as well with other colleagues who might find it useful. So we're going to pass over now to Nicola, who's going to take you through the session, and we'll come back to you at the end. Hi, Nicola.
Hi, Kevin. Thanks for having me. So I'm going to be giving an introduction to economic abuse. I thought I would start with a little bit of an introduction to the charity Surviving Economic Abuse. Our mission basically is to raise awareness of this form of abuse and to help transform responses to it. So organisations that are providing money advice services is something that this is relevant to. We have 4 strategic priorities. The first of those is in relation to awareness raising. So as Elaine said in the intro, not everyone always recognises economic abuse. So part of our work is to work with the media and through charities and organisations such as the Charity for Civil Servants to raise awareness about what this form of abuse is and what it might look like. We also support professionals in terms of their responses, including money advice services, as I just mentioned, and we do that through offering training on economic abuse, and we're also developing a range of resources that are tailored for different professionals through their interaction with individuals on the front line. The third element of our work is systems change. So this is when you might be supporting an individual or be an individual who's perhaps experiencing economic abuse. Potentially you might go to an organisation and ask them to do something for you, and they might say that they're unable to do that because of the system they might have. So an example here would be somebody who might have a joint account with someone, a joint bank account, and wants to be removed from that joint bank account. And you might go to the bank and ask them to do that, and they might say that their system means that they can't do that. So part of our work is to work with people like banks and to explain why this would be inappropriate in an economic abuse situation. In relation to this particular situation, this would give control to the perpetrator, who would have to agree to having somebody's name removed from a joint account, and demonstrating that, you know, where systems are actually facilitating abuse, we might want to look at those again and perhaps change the system accordingly. And then the fourth piece of work that we do is around policy influencing. And listeners may or may not be aware that there is a domestic abuse bill, which is going to receive its second reading in Parliament in a couple of weeks now. And we've been very much influencing the content of that bill. What's really important from our perspective is that the current policy definition of domestic abuse, under which economic abuse sits, talks about it including physical, psychological, sexual and financial abuse. And what we've been arguing is that we would like to change the term financial abuse, which sits in the policy definition, to economic abuse, which would sit within the new definition within the domestic abuse bill. And really importantly, the new bill will provide a statutory definition of domestic abuse as opposed to the policy definition, which people can choose to work to or not. The new statutory definition will be something that everybody does have to adhere to. And we're really pleased that the draft domestic abuse bill, as it's going to be introduced to Parliament, does for the first time recognise economic abuse. And the reason why we think that's so important is that we know through our research and practice, perpetrators use more rather than just finances and money through which to exert control in their intimate partner relationships. They also use economic resources more broadly, so things that money can buy, such as housing, transport, right down to people's ability to feed themselves, clothe themselves, sometimes even to access utilities such as electricity or heating. So we understand financial abuse, the term, to be a subcategory of economic abuse, and the importance for us about it being recognised in relation to the bill is recognising that broader form of control that perpetrators will use. So I'm just showing on screen now the proposed new statutory definition of domestic abuse, and you can see there that alongside psychological, physical and sexual, as well as emotional violence, economic abuse is recognised there too. Although I would say obviously that this proposed definition will go through Parliament, and this might not be the final definition that we see in statute. But really excitingly for surviving economic abuse, the statute does for the first time in its proposed form actually provide a definition of economic abuse. So up until now there's been no official definition. This one very much draws on an academic definition that we've been using in the US. And basically it talks about emotional economic abuse as being defined as any behaviour that has a substantial and adverse effect on an individual's ability to acquire, use or maintain money or other property, or goods or services. And you can see from the explanatory notes that sit alongside the bill that properties would cover things such as mobile phone or a car, and goods and services would cover, for example, things such as heating or items such as food or clothing. So you can see very much that this proposed definition of economic abuse is much broader than financial abuse, which is what we asked for. So I suppose if we look at any behaviour that's noted within the definition of economic abuse, what do those different behaviours look like? And this might be what you're particularly interested in as someone who's listening to this podcast in terms of how you might be able to recognise it. So basically there's three types of behaviour. We recognise those as control, exploitation or sabotage. So an example of control, for example, might be an abusive partner demanding to know how money is being spent, making their partner ask for money, and perhaps making financial decisions without discussion or keeping information secret from their partner, so that they're kind of operating from an economically blind perspective, which makes it then very difficult to know what resources they might have access to if they were to leave. And this is all very, very important potentially when we're thinking about our economic well-being. The second type of behaviour, exploitation. So this might be economic exploitation. So perhaps a partner moving in very quickly with a new partner, not contributing to bills or rent, perhaps building up debt under the partner's name. That might be fraudulently or through coercion, essentially making a partner give them money which they promise to pay back, which they don't. So economically exploitative behaviour. And then we start to see how economic abuse does overlap with the other forms of abuse which are recognised within that statutory definition of domestic abuse, which I showed to you. So here we might see how economic abuse overlaps with sexual exploitation. So perhaps asking a partner or demanding that a partner perform sexual favours in exchange for economic resources. And then we also have sabotage. So here a partner might destroy the possessions of another partner, sabotage their employment. So this is how you might see this happening in the workspace. And sabotaging someone's credit rating through, for example, the exploitation that we talked about of building debts up under somebody's name. And we think it's really important. A lot of the time when we think about economic abuse, we think about the control part of things, but actually the exploitation and sabotage might be equally as significant. So someone might absolutely be in control of their economic resources, but if someone's exploiting and sabotaging them, then they won't have the economic resources very long, and potentially would be in exactly the same situation as someone who was actually controlling their economic resources. And the point being that the abuser wants to remove all economic resources and access to, because that's basically what creates the barrier to leaving. Potentially someone wouldn't have access to a car or a bank account so that they couldn't physically leave and pay for overnight accommodation. So obviously the access to economic resources is vitally important when someone's seeking to leave. And having access to them does provide options. It does provide a way forward for somebody. And obviously, if those things aren't there, then that can be in a very difficult situation and a real barrier to leaving. So in terms of prevalence then, there isn't, as you would imagine, national prevalence around economic abuse because we're only just introducing a definition of what we mean by that. But if we look at the subcategory of financial abuse, there was a piece of research I did back in 2015 with Refuge and the Cooperative Bank, where we found that 1 in 5 adults reported experiencing financial abuse in a current or a former relationship. One of the reasons why we had to do that piece of work was because similarly, we don't know too much about financial abuse nationally. And that might be because previously it's been conceptualised as a form of psychological abuse. And again, there we see a real overlap between financial abuse and psychological abuse, which I will go on to talk about a little bit later. Just to flag that the Crime Survey for England and Wales, which is the national measure that we have around domestic abuse. So when we talk about 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men experiencing domestic abuse across their lifetime, that comes from an anonymous survey delivered via the Crime Survey for England and Wales. That survey does ask a question about financial abuse, but it asks whether a partner has prevented you from having a fair share of the household money. And I don't know, listeners listening, what you think about that question, but obviously we would say a fair share is actually a very subjective measure and people might interpret that differently. And that might signify abuse, or similarly, it might signify just a different sharing of household resources, which potentially someone doesn't agree with. So I do think we have to tread quite carefully around this question. But really interestingly, the Office for National Statistics, which actually reports on the Crime Survey for England and Wales, doesn't report on the answer to this question separately. Actually, what it does is ask a question about emotional abuse as well, and then presents the answers to both questions as non-physical forms of abuse. So again, another reason potentially why we don't talk about financial or economic abuse as a society, because we're not really naming it or talking about it at that national level. Rather, at the moment, the focus is very much on non-physical abuse. So part of our work around the bill, now economic abuse is included in the statutory definition, is that we would very much like there to be some questions within the Crime Survey for England and Wales which very much does focus on economic abuse, gives us an idea of prevalence, and importantly for us as a charity, it also will serve to demonstrate whether or not we're being effective in terms of our work to raise awareness of this issue. So in the past 8 years or so, researchers have been able to actually measure economic abuse and statistically shown that it is a distinct construct, that it is important to differentiate it from psychological abuse, because as you can imagine, the impact, whilst there might be a psychological impact, there's also going to be an economic impact, and money advice services and others are very well placed to be able to respond to what those economic impacts might be. Because there's no national measure, again, as a charity, Surviving Economic Abuse in December 2017 looked at the new offence of coercive or controlling behaviour, which listeners might or might not be familiar with. It was introduced by the Serious Crime Act at the end of 2015, and it talks about a partner coercively controlling another partner or family member. And when we analysed successful prosecutions of the coercive or controlling behaviour, we found that 6 in 10 of those cases featured at least one example of economic abuse. And we actually drew on the definition that I've presented to you on economic abuse, looking at the ability to acquire, use and maintain economic resources as how we analysed those successful prosecutions. We only had 35 cases to look at back in 2017, but our most recent analysis of 178 successful prosecutions is pretty much finding similar numbers in relation to this, with around 6 in 10 cases featuring at least one example of economic abuse. So we would argue, based on these findings, that economic abuse is more likely to be present than it is not to be present. So just to give you a few examples of what these behaviours might look like in practice, breaking down acquire, use and maintain. We found of those original 35 cases, 7 examples where a perpetrator was sabotaging someone's employment, so either forcing them to leave their job, making them reduce their hours so that they'd earn less money, or threatening to get their partner sacked. In 2 cases, the partner was able to work, but basically the partner was keeping her wages. So here we had economic exploitation. In 1 case, the abuser kept all but £500 of his partner's monthly wages of £2,000. And in another case, the partner was given just £10 a week of her wages after the perpetrator took all her bank cards. Some examples then of using economic resources. We had 12 examples here of the victim's ability to use their economic resources being thwarted. So in 5 cases, the perpetrator was monitoring their partner's finances. In 2 cases, restricting use of their mobile phone, so looking at economic resources more broadly. 1, controlling access to utilities, and 4, restricting access to a car. And then maintaining economic resources, we found this was the most common example, and I would say that the idea of a partner refusing to contribute, so this idea of not paying towards rent and mortgages, but potentially demanding a certain kind of lifestyle, so still wanting the partner to kind of pay for things, to take out loans, to create a lifestyle to which the perpetrator would like to become accustomed, does seem to be one of the forms of economic abuse that we're hearing more and more about. So here we had 4 examples of mobile phones being smashed, 2 cases of clothes being destroyed. And you can imagine if these are work clothes, you know, the impact that then has on the ability not to be able to go to work and earn an income. In 3 cases, money was borrowed but not paid back. In 5 cases, damaged property. In 2 cases, the bank account was emptied. In another 2 cases, the partner was making to take out debt or credit. And in 1 case, the perpetrator refused to leave the house. So again, we can see the broad range of economic abusively tactics that are being used here. When we look at prevalence within domestic abuse services, unsurprisingly, the prevalence is a lot higher because our population in this case is just those who are surviving domestic abuse. And we find here that Evan Stark, who's an academic from the US, talks about, from his practice, seeing perpetrators deprive partners of money in more than half of abusive relationships, and also other vital resources. And then we see within domestic abuse services more generally, various different studies that have been done around the prevalence of economic abuse. Victims and survivors report anywhere between 43 to 98% of economic abuse. So again, you know, this issue, whilst it's prevalent within society generally, obviously is very high in terms of the experience of those experiencing domestic abuse. So what I want to do now is talk a little bit more about how economic abuse does overlap with other forms of abuse, because it's very rare that you would see this happen in isolation. That would really be very much about exploitation in the purest sense. But what we're talking about here is economic abuse within intimate partner relationships. And this is a really powerful quote from a woman called Annie. Surviving economic abuse basically works alongside a group called Experts by Experience, made up of over 100 survivors of economic abuse. And basically, it's their experiences and what they tell us that informs the work that we do. So Annie's really powerful quote here talks about how it's not like someone comes into your life one day and they hit you. They work on you slowly at first so that you put up with being here. I was so isolated, you're so controlled by that point. So what I wanted to do here was provide you with an example of the power and control wheel, which some listeners might be familiar or not familiar with. But basically, this is a survivor developed tool which a lot of domestic abuse services will use when meeting with the survivor, and they will go through their experiences. Because unfortunately, very often domestic abuse, even more broadly than economic abuse, is still not something that we would necessarily recognise as happening to us. Within society, we still think mostly that domestic abuse rather is mostly about physical violence. But what this diagram really powerfully demonstrates is that domestic abuse is actually about power and control. So it's about one partner thinking that they have the right to control the actions of their partner. And they might do that through lots of different ways. So they might use coercion and threats, intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation. They might minimise, deny and blame the victim for what's happening. They might use children. We talk here about using male privilege because this is women who've experienced domestic abuse, and quite often some of these behaviours are hidden in plain sight because they do draw on gendered constructs. But I would argue more broadly that here we're talking about any kind of privilege, and in terms of economic abuse, we'd be talking about some kind of economic privilege. But also, as you can see, the final tactic of power and control is economic abuse, which is what we're focusing on today. Really importantly, it's the physical and sexual violence that sits outside of the wheel, because sometimes physical or sexual violence won't be used at all. Basically, what we find is that the perpetrator will use controlling tactics, and these might well be enough for them to control their partner. But if their partner does challenge the control that's been exerted over them, then the perpetrator might escalate the form of control into physical or sexual violence. And as you can imagine, once somebody has experienced a physical or sexual assault, just knowing that that could be the outcome of challenging control then becomes very, very powerful, because if it's happened once, it's happened before. So usually what a lot of victims try and do is start to change their behaviour, modify their behaviour so that they don't challenge it in a way that would lead to a physical or sexual assault. So quite often when we talk to victims, they'll talk very much about walking on eggshells because they're trying really, really hard to stop a physical or sexual assault from happening. It's also worth pointing out at this point that, again, as a society, we would generally say to someone who's experiencing domestic abuse that they should just leave. We would think this is the safest thing to happen. But if you could potentially understand the dynamics of the power and control wheel that I've just showed you, actually the ultimate challenge of control would be leaving. And actually we find that this is the most risky time for somebody who does leave, because this is the time at which most domestic homicides happen. So we know that separation doesn't actually increase safety, doesn't create safety, it increases risk. So this is one of the reasons why we don't like using the term abusive relationship within the charity, because it suggests it's the relationship that's abusive, and one would assume therefore that if the relationship ends, then the abuse would end. But we know and find it important to actually name that perpetrator who's committing that violence, and what we need to do is make them accountable for what they're doing by naming them as an abuser, as opposed to talking more conceptually about an abusive relationship. So again, we know that 2 women a week are killed by a former or current partner in the UK, and as I said, the majority of these homicides will happen at the point of separation, because that's the ultimate challenge to the control, or soon after, so usually within 6 months of separation, where the perpetrator sees that the victim is very much moving forward with their life and realises that they're not going to go back to them. And quite often what we see in that first 6 months will be, again, an escalation of violence post-separation, perhaps whereby they're harassing potentially stalking the victim, and doing lots of things to try and get them to go back to the abuser. So none of this is to say that we shouldn't encourage people to leave, but what we should make sure we do is encourage them to leave safely. So always to make sure they're linked in with a specialist domestic abuse service who can safety plan and make sure that they are able to exit and rebuild their lives in a safe manner. So hopefully what I'm also demonstrating to you here is that economic abuse is not just economic abuse with the just in inverted commas. It doesn't come at the end of a long list and as a consequence therefore mean economic abuse is less important. Basically economic abuse as it's experienced within this dynamic of coercion and control, we argue actually underpins physical safety. What we have found is that, or the research has found, is that women who can't find £100 at short notice are 3.5 times more likely to experience domestic abuse. And that could very well be because if there are economic barriers to leaving, it means a lot of people who are being abused will stay with the abusive partner for longer and so experience more harm just by virtue of the fact that they can't leave the situation that they're in. So therefore they are going to experience more harm simply because they can't exit. We also know through research that women experiencing coercive control and also economic abuse are actually at increased risk of being killed. And one of my roles at the charity is to sit on the quality assurance panel at the Home Office, which basically looks at homicide review reports. So that 2 women a week who are killed by an abusive partner, once a month we will come together as a group and look at 8 reports of those women who have been killed. And we'll seek to understand what happened and seek to identify for learning going forward to make sure this doesn't happen again. And it's very rare for me to look at one of these reports, which are produced by local authorities. It's something that was introduced in 2004 as a statutory duty for local authorities when there's been a homicide in their area. It's very, very rare to look at one of these reports and not see economic abuse. So we really can't talk about just, as I said, inverted commas, economic abuse. This is absolutely central to physical safety. But also what's really important in relation to this issue and why it is so important to seek support post-separation is that the lack of economic resources and that sense of economic security post-separation is one of the primary reasons why a lot of victims will return to their partner, because it is so very, very difficult, especially when they do have children, to support themselves independently. So we really have to think about economic and physical safety when we're talking about economic abuse. And again, this is probably one of the reasons why as a society we don't necessarily recognise or talk about economic abuse, because again, as I hope I've illustrated so far, quite often the economic abuse is happening alongside these other forms of coercion and control as part of this pattern of behaviour. So again, this is a really powerful quote taken from the Refuge in the Cooperative research in 2015, where a victim said the economic abuse was interwoven with it all. I didn't see it as one thing on its own. So again, it might not be until the point of leaving when a victim realises that they don't have any economic resources left, or perhaps when they're starting to rebuild their life, that they recognise that they've got nothing to draw on, or potentially they might even recognise that they're in a lot of debt, which might not be something they were aware of when they were still with the abuser. So again, it's really important to explore the economic aspects of abuse once somebody has left, to ascertain what situation they're in and to be able to support them appropriately going forward. And so actually, in order to illustrate this point, back in 2008, which is when I first did a piece of research in relation to this area, I adapted the power and control wheel, which I've already shown you, to create the economic power and control wheel. So basically, it looks exactly the same, but all the examples of controlling behaviour are examples of economic abuse, which basically demonstrates how economic abuse can both reinforce and overlap with all the controlling tactics that I talked about. And what I'm going to do now is just go on to talk about 2 of those in a little bit more detail. So, for example, that controlling tactic of isolation. This one is really, really important in terms of coercive control and will be something that abusers really seek to achieve. And that's for 3 reasons. Firstly, because if you isolate an abuser, if you isolate a victim, then the abuser successfully removes the sources of support that that victim can access. So if you're not allowed to go to work, if you're not allowed to leave the house, then there aren't colleagues or friends or family members who could potentially challenge some of the things that the victim will be told by the abuser. And that sort of leads into another point here, is that the abuser basically wants to be the victim's only point of reference. So they want to exert their form of truth on the victim. And that would be that the victim is worthless, that nobody else would have them, that they couldn't survive on their own, that they're responsible for the abuse that they're experiencing. So all these messages which the perpetrator will give the victim to stop them from leaving can only be challenged by other people. And obviously the abuser wants to close down opportunities for that to happen. But also, not only are you removing sources of support, but you're removing safe spaces. So places where a victim could go to report the abuse that they're experiencing. Because if the victim is at home all the time and is only hearing what the abuser has to say, then it's very, very, very difficult then for them to reach out and access support and to know that they're deserving of support. And there's just a few examples here of economic abuse and how that might go through isolation. So things like denying a partner access to transportation, limiting the amount of petrol they have in their car. So we hear a really common example would be only to have £5 worth of petrol in a car, which means the victim's only able to go and pick the kids up from school or drop them off. It means they've got no petrol to go elsewhere or do anything. Not allowing a partner to use the telephone. So again, closing down that communication with friends or family. Not giving a partner any money to go anywhere or do anything. So an example I often use here would be you might be invited out to coffee with your friends, and on the first time a friend might treat you to coffee, or on a second outing you might forget your purse, and probably the third time a friend asks you out for coffee, you might make an excuse not to go because of the embarrassment of not being able to pay for that coffee. Especially if from the outside looking in, you do have access to a lot of economic resources. So we can also see how this behaviour also, again, starts to change the behaviour of the person who's experiencing the abuse. And as I already mentioned, stopping a partner from going to work is very, very powerful here. I also wanted to mention emotional abuse because I've talked about how economic abuse was seen as a form of emotional abuse historically. And there really is a very strong overlap. So if I were to see any other form of abuse operating alongside economic abuse, at least in the early stages, I would expect to see emotional abuse. And what's really interesting here is that when you talk to victims of economic abuse, they'll talk very much about how their partner through the economic abuse made them feel worthless. And obviously you can see how there also are connotations around the use of worthless in terms of people's own self-worth. So this idea that they don't deserve to have money spent on them or have access to economic resources. So denying a partner access to basic necessities such as heating or water. So not being able to turn the heating on or turn a tap on or flicking a light switch without having the permission of the abuser before they do that. Again, a really powerful demonstration of this would be when the former Home Secretary Amber Rudd launched the consultation around the domestic abuse bill. She appeared on the One Show, and she talked very much about how this is an invisible form of abuse unless we look for it. And so she talked about a police officer who was called out to a domestic incident, who arrived. There didn't seem to be anything untoward, but the police officer in this case walked around the property, and when they came into the kitchen, they found there was a post-it note on the refrigerator. On an inspection of that post-it note, it said, "Ask the master before helping yourself." So you could see here, economic abuse to the point where someone couldn't access food without asking first. Making a partner beg for money is similarly as degrading, particularly when it does accompany sexual violence, as we mentioned earlier, around sexual exploitation. But again, something that we see very, very often, and what we might have seen in that refrigerator when the police officer opened the door, was that quite often people within a household are living very different lives. So quite often the victim and the children are only allowed to eat sort of value branded food, whereas the perpetrator will usually be eating kind of high-end food. We see that translate into the bathroom, for example, in terms of toiletries and products. So value and basic products for victims and high-end expensive products for the perpetrator. So we see this perpetrator sense of entitlement here, and we can also see that if someone is living alongside that and very much being reminded that they are kind of less than somebody else all the time, how that can have a really negative impact on their emotional well-being. So I think it's really important, again, when we go back and we challenge this idea that this is just economic abuse, that actually there's no real hierarchy of harm here. You can't say I'm not deserving of a response because I've just experience economic or psychological abuse, or is not worthy to give somebody a response just because they've experienced economic or psychological abuse. Again, for those who are familiar listeners, you might be more familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which very much talks about how we need to meet our basic needs before we can build on those needs. And really importantly, physiological needs such as food and water are at the very much bottom of this hierarchy, and we need to have those things in order to survive. So to be experiencing economic abuse and not to be able to have access to those things, can be absolutely awful for someone, who's basically seeking to survive life with an abuser. And if we can't meet those basic needs, then how can we possibly feel safe, and how can we feel secure if we don't have the resources, the property, the employment that we need in order to have a sense of safety? How then can we experience love and belonging if we don't have that security? How can we have family and friendships if we're not struggling to survive all the time? And similarly, we need all of those things if we're going to have a good sense of self-esteem. And most importantly, if we've got a good sense of self-esteem, then that's what's going to enable us to achieve self-actualization. And actually, that's what really, really drives me in relation to this area of work, is that I've met so many people who, if they hadn't have met someone who abused them in this way, could have gone on to achieve the most amazing things and had amazing life trajectories. And unfortunately, somebody did come along and disrupt that and cause them to lose the economic resources or the potential that they had to realise economic resources. So in terms of the support that we can provide to people, it's really important, because what we can do is help them to get their self-esteem back, and similarly to be able to make the very best of their lives. And I would also argue, usually also the lives of their children. So something else I'm going to talk about before I talk about how we're going to turn this economic risk into economic safety, which is a really important thing, is just to flag that economic abuse does happen post-separation. As I said, when the relationship ends, it doesn't mean the abuse ends as well. And actually, economic abuse is really significant here because it doesn't require the physical proximity that physical abuse does. So you need to know where somebody is and be in the same room as them to be physically abusive. But you can be economically abusive by not knowing even where the victim is living. But what we might find is that economic abuse takes different forms post-separation. So we might see it with a perpetrator taking a victim to court numerous times, which causes them to drain a lot of their economic resources, because that's a very expensive process if they don't have access to legal aid. It might mean controlling the payment of child maintenance. It might mean contact visits where children are sent home without their winter coat or their shoes, again leaving the victim to have to kind of keep replacing those items. It might be that the perpetrator takes out loans in the victim's name because, whilst technology is a great thing, at the same time, when an intimate partner has intimate details, knows, things like a mother's maiden name or the name of the dog or the make of a first car, it can be very easy online to fraudulently take out money in someone else's name. So I suppose what we should also remember if we're wanting to support survivors of economic abuse is that probably going to be simultaneously trying to overcome the economic damage which was inflicted by the abuser when they were in the relationship, but then also dealing with new forms of economic abuse post-separation. And this can feel really bleak indeed. And we actually ran a round table at the Home Office, again as part of the consultation around the bill, where we had 18 survivors around the table talking about economic abuse and the impact it had on their lives. And one of the participants basically said that economic abuse was her past, her present and her future. And that was the name that we gave to the report on the round table, which I think is really very significant. A lot of victims can't imagine a time where they're not experiencing economic abuse. And very sadly, a lot of the women in the Experts by Experience group will have been experiencing economic abuse post-separation for 10 years and more. So something just to say, I suppose, in terms of what we would say is the flip side of coercive control, the idea of space for action. So if you're being coercively controlled, you don't have much space for action, not many choices, not many options, as I explained back in terms of why someone wouldn't leave. But when you do leave, one would assume that the coercive control would diminish to the point that your space for action would grow. And a piece of research I did again back in around 2013 here kind of looked at this concept, and we found that space for action did of course increase after leaving, but really importantly and significantly here, finances and the space for action in relation to those stayed low and remained low, whereas other domains of people's lives, such as their ability to socialise with friends and family, to take part in community, their sort of health and well-being, all increased at a lot a much greater rate. So I suppose the ripple effect then is that there might be forgone professional development, the ability to maximise potential. We've talked about economic loss, being left in debt, so very much Elaine's area of work here, or credit rating, unable to access economic resources, and sometimes also a criminal record. So some victims might be so desperate to access economic resources, especially if they have children, they might turn to the shoplifting. The perpetrator might have made them claim benefits fraudulently, which they're then very scared of someone finding out about. And again, that would be an example of the control that an abuser would exert. Don't leave me, because if you do, I'm going to report you for benefit fraud. But also, and just significantly in terms of just managing generally, there might be, whilst leaving, the perpetrator might increase safety or remove the domestic abuse, but it might then open other avenues for abuse. So we see increasingly people who are struggling financially being offered or the opportunity to exchange sex for rent rather than money. Instead, someone perhaps who's left in a lot of debt might have to borrow from a payday loan, and then might similarly experience violence or sexual violence from someone who is going to be collecting that money. And at the same time, we also hear, and this is not to suggest for a second that if you've experienced abuse in one relationship, you will necessarily go on to experience abuse going forward. But a lot of victims do say they started to live with a new partner a bit sooner than they would have chosen to because of the economic pressures of being a one-person household or a one-parent household as well. So we can just see how economic pressures broadly might lead you into entering into relationships and those relationships becoming a little bit more serious sooner than you would want them to. So how then do we turn this economic risk into economic safety? Basically, there's two strands of work which we exist basically to build capacity around. So the first is that the victim does need to de-link economic connections with the abuser as much as they can. And also, and this is a role that charity here might be able to play, talks very much about financial assistance in relation to debts, especially priority debts, is maximising someone's access to economic resources. So trying to remove as much debt as possible, so that money is not going into repayments, but it's going into someone's ability to kind of live and mean that they can make those choices, so that they don't necessarily, as I say, potentially have to live with someone else and be dependent on them, because obviously, as we can see, that creates a vulnerability to abuse. And the reason why we might want to do this and why it's so important to recognise economic abuse early on, as I indicated earlier, is that research into domestic abuse has suggested that economic abuse might precede physical violence. So if we can identify and act on economic abuse early, then potentially we can stop abuse escalating. Also, there are so many organisations out there that are really well placed to help do this, because if we do understand the dynamics of domestic abuse and behaviours linked to economic abuse, then there's more that we can do, as I say early on, that would inform our preventative efforts and also help us to close down those opportunities which exist in systems which abusers take advantage of. So if we think about identifying economic abuse, who's at risk of it, as I've said, anybody is at risk. A lot of the research that I have shared today is around gender, and that's because historically women have experienced economic disadvantage through virtue of being women. So, for example, not being able to take out a mortgage or credit in their own name until very, very recently. So operating at an economic disadvantage, which some perpetrators would take advantage of. But that's not to say that that's the only inequality. So you can see here in our list, we have disabled men and gay men have economic disadvantage, which means that they're increased risk of economic abuse because there's a number of inequalities coming together, which makes things, for example, like paid work, more difficult to achieve, but also in relation to disabled women. This is probably a very short list. This is what we've been able to demonstrate in research around economic abuse. But, you know, similarly, I would argue things like immigration status is going to be really relevant here as well, because what you're doing through the immigration status when someone's coming into the country and has a sponsor is making them economically dependent on the perpetrator, because they're not able to access welfare benefits, which means it would be very difficult to leave because there's no safety net there, which would obviously capture other groups. So we do need to think about multiple inequalities and how these might come together and disadvantage certain individuals. So men or women with lots of different inequalities that might be a feature of their lives. So signs then, actually economic abuse can be very subtle and hard to identify. I was talking a little bit earlier about some gender norms. We talk about kept women a lot. We don't really question why women might be at home looking after her children and not at work. So abusers quite often kind of use what we see as kind of acceptable gender roles to underpin the abuse. And they might use it against the victim. So they might say, you know, you don't need to work. Why would you want to work? We have children. You can't possibly be a good mother if you work as well as look after the children. So you can see there an example of how gender might be used and how that might then make this form of abuse seem invisible. But if we're aware, again, as I said, of the dynamics, then it is easier for us to identify what's going on and potentially to be questioning what we are seeing. There are particular signs of economic abuse which professionals might come across in their work. So things like rent arrears. Rent arrears is a massive warning sign. Also being in debt and accessing a debt service. So again, very relevant to the service that Elaine is providing. Not knowing much about or having access to family finances. Something we hear quite regularly is a victim not knowing how much a partner earns. So it might be that you are working with an individual who struggles to draw up a budget because they don't know how much money is coming in, or perhaps says that they don't have any money left over, or you can see that there's quite a lot of money coming in. So things like that might make you question what's going on, and economic abuse might be one of the things that you might consider if something's not adding up. Also things like seeing all the liabilities in a victim's name and all the assets in an abuser's name is quite a telltale sign of economic abuse, because obviously the abuser wants to stop the victim from leaving, and obviously if they have no assets in their name but lots of liabilities, then that can be very difficult, especially in today's world of having to be credit checked for lots of things. Shortage of social housing, meaning a lot of victim survivors have to go into private rented accommodation. So you can see some of the difficulties there in terms of how you'd seek to rebuild your life. But similarly, someone, from the outside looking in, they might have a good job, a nice house, cars in the driveway, so you might struggle to understand how they're struggling from an economic perspective. And that might be they lose perhaps a lot of weight, perhaps they're wearing clothes that are too big for them, perhaps they are forgetting their purse, perhaps they can't answer things like how much their partner earns. So again, lots of different warning signs potentially that someone might be experiencing economic abuse. So in terms of organisational responses then, in some ways we have to look at this at two different levels. You might, as a professional or somebody listening to this podcast, be in a position where you have service users or clients or customers who might be experiencing economic abuse, but at the same time we must always recognise that actually that professional themselves might be experiencing economic abuse within that context of domestic abuse, or a colleague who you're working alongside similarly might be experiencing domestic abuse. So we do have to be aware that when we respond to this issue, either as an organisation, supporting service users, we also have to be thinking about our colleagues as well and their well-being. So again, this would be another demonstration that both Kevin and Elaine talked about sort of how money advice services, would be very closely linked to your well-being and health more broadly. So important things that organisations can do would be to provide training on domestic abuse and then explore economic abuse in more detail within that. And especially if you're working in the money sphere, obviously this focus on economic abuse and its dynamics can be particularly useful. Be able to consider potential warning signs and hopefully through training and an open culture where we're talking about economic abuse, perhaps build the confidence to actually ask questions in relation to it. We do know that lots of victims want people to ask questions about economic abuse, that they're kind of waiting for an opportunity or an invitation to tell. So actually, some people are scared of asking the question, but it's actually something that a lot of victims say they wish has happened. You might consider undertaking routine screening for domestic or economic abuse. And we do have a screening tool at Surviving Economic Abuse, which we can train individuals to use. Ensuring safety considerations are built into practice. So just making sure that systems do make sure that the victim is safe. And as I also said a bit earlier, close down opportunities for abusers to manipulate those systems. As I said, the ability to look after colleagues as well as service users. So you might want to think about a domestic abuse policy that sits within HR. And all those things that you would want to make sure are working alongside or in tandem with services that already work in this area, because it's not up to anybody to deal with the domestic abuse. You know, that's the role of domestic abuse services, but you can absolutely play a part, you know, in that wider support offer. So really important to create links with and ideally work with national and local specialist domestic abuse services. But at the very least, even if you're not having conversations with people about this issue, it's not something they want to talk about, you know, you can provide a conducive context so that a victim survivor knows that it is an issue. There might be information, literature around which would encourage them and support them, potentially, you know, to phone a helpline in relation to this issue, you know, to know that it is an issue that they can reach out and access support around. You know, at the same time, provide a context where there is safe spaces to report. You know, so saying to employees, you know, there is an office or a computer or a telephone that you can use if you need to. And also really, really importantly here is help the victim envisage an alternative life. Because going back to that point I made around isolation at the very beginning, you know, the abuser will have created a certain narrative or reality which the victim will have been forced to accept. And basically what you can do is gently challenge that narrative. So if the perpetrator said you couldn't survive on your own, you could potentially say to someone, you know what, you know, you could access benefits. You know, if we worked on a budget based on the benefits that you could access, you know, look here, you could afford rent, you know, you could afford to support yourself and any children you might have. So a really important thing that you can do is to help the victim envisage that alternative world. And you could work with an employee to ensure that they have access to money. So that could be working with payroll, for example. It might be that you can siphon some money from the general wages off into another account, which the perpetrator doesn't know about. As I said, develop an HR policy on domestic abuse, which includes economic abuse. That might offer, for example, paid leave if someone's experiencing domestic abuse. It might create a mechanism to receive a salary advance or an interest-free loan or a grant, which would help them to leave and rebuild their lives. And also provide information on funds that are available. So, you know, some of these funds that do exist for those who have worked in certain professions and which do make funds available when someone's experiencing hardship. So really, just to conclude there, there is a lot that as an individual or as an organisation we can do to support victims and survivors around this issue, simply in terms of recognising it, working out that there is some kind of risk that needs to be addressed, and then lots of things that can be done, again, by an individual or an organisation to create that economic safety. So those of you listening live, there is an opportunity for questions, and very happy to answer those. But if you'd like to get in touch with us directly, feel free to access our website and also follow us on Twitter. So thank you everyone for listening.
Nicola, a really powerful presentation. Thank you very much. And I was trying to think of the word to use really, but some sobering statistics in there as well. Should probably go without saying, if there's anybody listening who is or believes someone else is at immediate risk of serious harm, then they should call 999 or the local police. You mentioned, Nicola, the local and national domestic abuse services. How are they made available, and how can people generally access those?
Well, there is the National Domestic Violence Helpline, which is run in partnership between Refuge and Women's Aid. So if someone's not at immediate danger, and you're right, Kevin, to say to call 999 in those cases, but do want to talk about their experience and understand more about it, and to explore that, and perhaps to get some validation that what they're experiencing is domestic abuse, then they can call that helpline. Or if you're a concerned friend or family member or professional, you can call that helpline too. And that helpline does kind of act as a gateway for accessing local services. But at the same time, if you do Google National Domestic Violence Helpline, there is a link there which would enable someone to explore what local services are available for them as well.
That's really helpful, thanks. You also mentioned a screening tool that I believe your organisation has. Is that something available, or certainly more information about that on your website as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I'd encourage you to use the contact form on our website to get in touch in relation to that, because we do present that alongside some training, because obviously there's a certain way of delivering that screening tool. But again, we're very happy to work with individuals to be able to do that.
Sure, brilliant. And Elaine, there was a lot in there, obviously, about, well, certainly we sat here thinking there are opportunities there where the charity might be able to help. I just wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit more about that briefly.
Well, yes, just to reiterate that obviously we do provide financial assistance as well as money advice and the caring services. So if there's anyone who thinks they might need that, then please get in touch. We can help with things like rent arrears, pre-tenancy costs, as well as, you know, breathing space grants, one-off grants for different things. And alongside that, we can provide the full remit of debt advice services. So we can try and help rebuild sort of economic safety, as Nicola was talking about earlier.
I think what struck me was that how important those things are, Nicola, both you know, the before and after leaving. I hadn't perhaps appreciated that as much until you talked that through.
Yes, as I said, there's the experience within the relationship where the abuser is trying to kind of shut down opportunities, you know, to leave and to live independently, and then, as I said, that kind of sabotage and ongoing abuse post separation to try to get them to go back. So as you say, it does operate very much both within the actual relationship but also post separation. So we do need to provide support to survivors at both stages of their journey.
Great, thanks. That's all we have time for today. You hopefully can see on the screen the contact details for the Charity of Civil Servants now, our website, our helpline number, and our social media channels. We don't pretend to be the experts in this particular subject, but it's great to work with you, Nicola, and hopefully we can get the word out to people who may need it, or certainly those who can be more aware in their day-to-day work as well. So thank you so much, Nicola, for all of your help. And,
well, thank you for giving us this platform just to raise awareness, because it is hugely important. And if we can just support one person, you know, that means, you know, we're very happy. So thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. And thanks, Elaine, also for setting this up and making it happen. And just to say, if anyone does have any questions that you've typed in, we will get to those and put those the answers anonymously, of course, on our website. You'll find that on the webinar page of the website where you found your registration link for this session. You can also email us at webinar@foryoubyou.org.uk if you've got comments specific to this session, or for help related inquiries, to email us at help@foryoubyou.org.uk. Thanks once again, and we'll see you again soon.